The late afternoon sun hung low and heavy over Harmony Creek, bathing the town's single and dusty main street in a tarnished gold light. It was a light that didn't warm or beautify. It merely illuminated the grime, the cracked timber of the storefronts, and the deep, weary ruts carved by wagon wheels into the hard-packed earth. A tired breeze, carrying more dust than relief, nudged the saloon sign, causing the painted letters of the gilded cage to groan on their rusty hinges. From within, the clumsy, off-key notes of a piano tumbled out, a melody of forced cheerfulness that did little to mask the establishment's underlying melancholy. The tune mixed with the low rumble of men's voices and the sharp, cloying smell of burnt grease and stale spirits that bled through the swinging doors and into the street. It was the scent of a place where dreams came to die, or at least to be forgotten for a few hours. A figure emerged from the glare of the street, her silhouette wavering in the heat. She moved with a pronounced limp, favoring her left leg as if each step was a negotiation with old pain. Her dress was made of cheap, faded calico, the color washed out by too much sun and lye soap, clinging to a frame that was all sharp angles and weary resilience. The cuffs of her sleeves were frayed, and a dark, ugly bruise, the color of a fading plum, marred the pale skin of her right wrist. She clutched a canvas satchel to her chest, a lumpy, heavy thing that seemed to hold all her worldly possessions. She didn't pause to look at the men loitering on the saloon's porch, their chairs tipped back against the wall, their faces shadowed by the brims of their hats. She kept her gaze fixed on the side of the building, her destination the less traveled path that led to the back door, the entrance for servants and supplies. The kitchen door was ajar, hanging crookedly on one hinge. She pushed it open and stepped into a world of shadow and heat. The air was thick, heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 poorly cooked meals. A large woman with a face like a sour apple and arms as thick as stovepipes stood over a ledger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't look up immediately, letting the newcomer stand in silence, a silent test of patience. Finally, she closed the book with a snap. "What do you want?" Her voice was flat, devoid of welcome. The young woman, Nora Lane, drew a steadying breath. Her own voice, when it came, was low but clear, carrying a resonance of conviction that seemed at odds with her worn appearance. "I can cook," she said, the words simple and direct. "I can't flirt." A peal of laughter, sharp and bright as shattering glass, cut through the kitchen's gloom. A young woman emerged from the doorway leading to the main saloon floor, a vision in scarlet silk and cheap perfume. She was the proprietor's daughter, Ruby, her lips painted a defiant red, her eyes alight with a practiced, predatory amusement. She leaned against the doorframe, a tray of empty glasses balanced expertly on her hip. "Did you hear that? Ma, she can cook, but she can't flirt." Ruby's laugh rang out again, a mocking sound that echoed in the small, greasy space. The older woman, Martha, merely grunted, her gaze sweeping over Nora from the scuffed toes of her boots to the weary set of her shoulders. Cooking is only half the job in a place like this. Outside on the porch, one of the loiterers, having overheard the exchange through the open window, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Ain't that the truth?" he drawled to his companion, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Around here, it's the ones who know how to bat their lashes that get a square meal." His friends chuckled in agreement, their amusement a coarse, grating sound. Nora's jaw tightened, but she gave no other sign of having heard them. Her eyes remained fixed on Martha. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her canvas satchel on the corner of a long, scarred wooden work table. She unrolled the top, her movements economical and precise, and took out a small, well-cared-for paring knife. The wooden handle was dark and smooth from years of use, but the blade was clean, honed to a fine edge. She laid it on the worn cutting board, a block of wood so gouged and scarred it looked like an old map. In the dim light filtering in from the single dirty window, the steel edge caught a ray of the dying sun, and for a fleeting moment, It gleamed with a pure, silver light. Her hand trembled, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor born of exhaustion and hunger. But her resolve did not waver. She did not back down. Leaning against a porch post on the far side of the street, a tall cowboy named Jed McCrae had been watching the town settle into its evening rhythm. He was a quiet man, his face weathered by the sun and wind, his eyes a dark, unreadable gray. He had been observing the world with a detached sort of stillness, a man comfortable in his own skin and in no hurry to be anywhere else. He had seen the woman with the limp cross the street, had noted the determined set of her jaw. He'd heard the men's crass remarks and Ruby's scornful laugh. But it was the woman's voice, carried on the thin evening air, that snagged his attention. "I can cook, I can't flirt." It wasn't a plea or a boast. It was a statement of fact, as plain and solid as the ground beneath his boots. In a town full of bluster and lies, the simple truth of it was startling. His gaze, which had been lazily scanning the street, narrowed with a flicker of newfound curiosity, focusing on the dark rectangle of the kitchen doorway. Martha stared at the gleaming knife, then back at Nora's face. She saw no desperation there, only a stark, unbending dignity. It was an expression she hadn't seen in a long time. It irritated and intrigued her in equal measure. She let out a long, put-upon sigh. "All right," she said, her voice grudging. "You've got 1 hour. 1. The boys will be wanting their supper soon. If they eat without complaining, if they sit there and chew their food in silence, you can stay. For tonight." "Thank you, ma'am," Nora said, her voice even. Ruby pushed herself off the doorframe, her silk dress rustling. She glided past Nora, her scent of cheap lavender overpowering the smell of old grease for a moment. As she passed, she leaned in close, her voice a venomous whisper. "Good luck with that. The coal stove's been in a mood all day." She smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gloom, before disappearing back into the main room. Nora turned to face her new adversary. The stove was a monstrous thing of cast iron, streaked with rust and coated in a layer of grime. A plume of thick, acrid smoke puffed from a loose joint in its flue, and the fire within burned with a sullen, inconsistent heat. The main griddle was warped, and a large cast-iron skillet sitting on it was stained with the black residue of burnt food. A low, sizzling sound came from a slick of grease popping in the heat. For a moment, the challenge seemed insurmountable. The kitchen was a disaster, the tools were poor, and her audience was hostile. Nora closed her eyes and took a deep, slow breath, drawing the smoky air into her lungs. The world fell away, the mocking laughter, the skeptical eyes, the ache in her leg. There was only the heat, the iron, and the task at hand. She opened her eyes, her gaze clear and focused. "Cook, not court," she murmured to herself. A quiet affirmation. "That's enough." From his vantage point across the street, Jed saw the slump of the woman's shoulders as the saloon girl passed her, the almost imperceptible moment of defeat. But then he saw her straighten up, saw her turn to face the hulking black stove. He couldn't see her expression, but he could read the language of her posture. It was the stance of someone facing a charging bull or a rising river, shoulders back, feet planted, a quiet gathering of strength. It was a strange and compelling sight. Most folks in this town met their troubles with a loud complaint or a hasty retreat. This woman met hers with a silent, squared-off defiance. Jed pushed his hat back on his head, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. He had intended to move on, to find a quieter spot to wait for the evening to cool. But now, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself wanting to see what would happen next. He settled his weight back against the post, his curious gaze fixed on the little drama unfolding in the kitchen of the gilded cage. He decided he would wait, with Martha's grudging permission hanging in the air. Nora took a moment to truly assess the space she had been granted. It was a battlefield, and she was a lone soldier facing a deeply entrenched enemy of filth and neglect. Before she began her work, she turned to the older woman, who was still watching her with undisguised skepticism. "My name is Nora Lane," she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm a widow. I cooked for a prospecting party in the mountains for 2 years. She offered no more. It was a resume delivered without flourish, a simple statement of her history and capabilities. Martha just grunted in response, a sound that could have meant anything, and returned to her ledger, leaving Nora to her task. Nora began by rolling up the sleeves of her worn calico dress. The movement was practical, unthinking, but it revealed a testament to her past. Her hands were not the soft, delicate hands of a saloon girl. They were tools, shaped by labor. The skin was rough, cross-hatched with fine lines and dotted with calluses at the base of her fingers and across her palms. Her right pinky finger had a slight, permanent crook to it, the lingering ghost of a break that had healed poorly without a doctor's care. Higher up her arms, a tracery of old scars marred the skin. They were pale, silvery marks, the kind left by the angry spit of hot grease or a careless brush against a searing iron stove. Each mark was a lesson learned, a permanent reminder of the unforgiving nature of her trade. She flexed her fingers, the motion familiar and reassuring, and turned her full attention to the kitchen. It was worse than she had first imagined. A thick, rancid smell hung in the air, a combination of old fat, sour dishwater, and smoke. A bucket in the corner held a congealed layer of grease, a pale and waxy testament to weeks of lazy disposal. The pots hanging from hooks on the wall were coated in a layer of black soot so thick it hid the metal beneath. The great cast-iron cauldron, sitting cold near the hearth, had a crust of some long-forgotten stew welded to its bottom. She peered into the small larder, a dark, musty closet that served as the saloon's pantry. Her inventory was grim, a half-empty sack of cornmeal slumped in one corner, its contents tasting faintly of the burlap it was stored in. Beside it sat a crate of dried beans, hard as pebbles, and a net of onions, most of which were soft and beginning to sprout pathetic green shoots. There was no fresh meat, no vegetables to speak of, no spices beyond a tin of salt and a cracked jar of peppercorns. It was a kitchen starved of care and resources, designed to produce food that filled bellies but offered no pleasure. For another woman, the sight might have been cause for despair. For Nora, it was simply the starting point. She moved with a speed and efficiency born of long practice, a routine ingrained in her muscles like a prayer. This was a ritual of survival she had performed in countless dirty, makeshift kitchens. First, she dealt with the rancid grease. She carried the heavy bucket outside, her limp more pronounced under the weight, and emptied its contents into a deep hole she dug behind the building. Far from the well, she would not cook in a kitchen that smelled of decay. Returning inside, she stoked the fire in the main hearth, getting a large kettle of water to a rolling boil. She poured the scalding water into the filthy pots and pans, the steam rising in a great, cleansing cloud. The heat and water loosened the worst of the grime. Then came the salt. She poured a generous amount into the great cauldron and took a stiff brush, scrubbing with a fierce, circular motion. Her shoulders ached and her breath came in short, sharp bursts, but she did not stop until the black crust gave way, revealing the dark, pitted iron beneath. She did the same with the skillet, scraping and scouring, her movements relentless, until the cooking surface shone with the dull, silver gray of clean, well-cared-for steel. With her tools clean, she turned her attention to the temperamental stove. Ruby's warning had not been an exaggeration. The fire was sluggish, choking on its own smoke. Nora opened the iron door and, using a small shovel, cleared out the compacted, half-burnt clinkers that were starving the coals of air. She laid a new bed for the fire with a meticulous hand, a crumpled sheet of old newspaper, a handful of dry wood shavings scraped from the bottom of the kindling box, and a few small, dry sticks arranged in a careful lattice. She lit the paper and watched the small flame lick at the shavings. Then the kindling. It was a hesitant, fragile thing. She knelt on the hard floor, her face close to the opening, and blew a long, slow, steady stream of air onto the embers. It was a gentle but persistent encouragement, a long breath, as she thought of it, coaxing the life back into the fire. The embers glowed brighter. from orange to a brilliant yellow-white. The new coals caught, and soon a clean, strong flame was dancing in the stove, its heat steady and true. The stove was no longer her enemy. It was her ally. Now, she could cook. The menu was dictated by the pathetic contents of the larder. It would be a simple, honest meal. She measured out the cornmeal, adding a pinch of salt and enough water to form a thick, pliable dough. Her hands, rough as they were, moved with a surprising delicacy, patting the dough into small, round cakes. In another pot, she set the beans to simmer with one of the less wilted onions, saving the best for later. While the beans softened, she took the cleanest-looking onion, its skin dry and papery, and placed it on her newly scrubbed cutting board. Outside, Jed McCrae had not moved from his post. The sounds from the kitchen had changed. The initial clatter and angry scraping had given way to a more purposeful rhythm. Now, a new sound reached him, sharp and distinct in the evening air. It was the sound of a knife on a wooden board. Thump, 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 thump. It was not a frantic, hurried chopping, but a steady, measured beat, as even and reliable as the gait of a good horse. It was the sound of competence, of someone who knew her tools and her trade. He found himself unconsciously tapping his finger against the wooden post in time with the rhythm, a small, involuntary acknowledgement of the skill it represented. The doors to the gilded cage swung open and shut, admitting a steady stream of thirsty, hungry men. The noise from the main room grew louder, a cacophony of rough laughter, shouted conversations, and the relentlessly cheerful piano. The orders began to flood the kitchen, shouted through the service window by a harried-looking Ruby. 2 plates for the miners at the corner table. Old Man Hemlock wants as usual 3 more for the cowboys playing cards. Ruby appeared in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed, a smug smile playing on her lips. She looked at the single pot of simmering beans and Nora's small stack of uncooked corn cakes. "That's all you've got," she scoffed. "There's a crew of Teamsters just sat down. They'll eat this place bare. I need 5 plates, in 10 minutes. She said it not as a request, but as a challenge, an impossible demand designed to make Nora fail. Nora felt a familiar knot of pressure tighten in her stomach. She bit her lip, the small pain a grounding sensation. She didn't waste breath arguing or making excuses. She simply nodded. Her calm, steady rhythm was shattered, replaced by a controlled flurry of motion. Her hands became a blur. The corn cakes hit the hot, greased skillet, sizzling instantly. She moved the cakes around with a deft flick of her wrist, ensuring they cooked evenly, developing a crisp, golden brown crust. With her other hand, she drained the beans and added the final ingredients, a spoonful of bacon fat she'd rendered from a small piece she found in the larder, and the finely chopped onion. The moment the onion hit the hot fat, a rich, savory aroma filled the kitchen, a smell that was wholesome and deeply comforting. It was the smell of a real meal, a stark contrast to the usual scent of scorched meat and stale beer. Her movements were a frantic but precise ballet. She never took her eyes off the stove, her focus absolute. Out in the saloon, the first plates were carried from the kitchen. A man at the bar, halfway through a loud story, stopped mid-sentence. He sniffed the air, his head turning toward the kitchen. The aroma cut through the stale air of the saloon, a simple but potent declaration of change. Another man, who had been grumbling about the wait, fell silent as a plate was set before him. He stared at the steaming corn cakes and the humble portion of beans, fragrant with fried onion. He took a bite, then another. The loud, boisterous energy of the room began to subside, replaced by the sounds of eating the scrape of forks on tin plates, the low murmurs of approval. Even the piano player, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, seemed to falter. His jaunty tune slowed, the notes becoming softer, more contemplative, as if even he were straining to listen, to catch the scent of something new, something unexpected, coming from the kitchen of the gilded cage. Ruby sauntered back toward the kitchen, a tray laden with empty plates balanced on her hip. Her lips were curled into a smirk, a well-practiced expression of condescending amusement. She had a dozen cutting remarks prepared, a fresh volley of scorn to launch at the strange, limping woman who dared to think that mere cooking could earn her a place in this world. She pushed through the swinging door, ready to deliver her verdict on the pathetic meal of beans and corn cakes, but the words died in her throat. She stopped, frozen for a single, jarring beat. The air in the kitchen had been transformed. The oppressive stench of old, burnt grease was gone, replaced by a clean, savory warmth, a rich, honest aroma of simmering stock, herbs, and slow-cooked meat now filled the small space. A scent so deeply comforting and unfamiliar in this place that it momentarily disarmed her. For the first time all evening, Ruby's mocking laughter faltered, and a flicker of genuine surprise crossed her face. Out in the main room, a quiet revolution was taking place. The usual boisterous clamor had subsided into a low, contented hum. Men who typically shoveled their food down with grim necessity were now eating slowly, thoughtfully. A gambler, known for his sour disposition and quick temper, carefully scraped the last of the stew from his bowl with a piece of corn cake. His shoulders, usually hunched in a posture of permanent aggression, visibly relaxed. At a corner table, a grizzled old ranch hand, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, put down his fork. He stared into his empty plate for a long moment, his eyes distant. His companion grunted a question. The old cowboy shook his head slowly, his voice raspy with an emotion he couldn't name. "This here," he said, his voice just loud enough to be heard by the men at the next table. "This is home." The word hung in the air, simple and profound, an alien concept in the transient, heartless world of the gilded cage. Martha, standing behind the bar, missed none of it. She saw the clean plates, heard the scattered murmurs of approval, and noted the unusual quiet. Her shrewd eyes narrowed. She had run this saloon for 15 years, and she knew that a single decent meal was a fluke, not a foundation. She wiped down the counter with a damp rag, her movements methodical, her expression unreadable. She would not be swayed by a pot of well-seasoned beans. "Beginner's luck," she muttered to herself, casting a skeptical glance toward the kitchen door. "Supper is the real test. That's the real fight." But the change was undeniable, and word began to travel with the speed of prairie gossip. A man leaving the saloon paused to speak with a friend just arriving. "You heading into the cage?" he asked. The friend nodded. "Get yourself a plate. Something's different. Different how Martha finally hire a girl who can smile." The first man shook his head. "Better. She hired someone who can cook. Food doesn't taste like ash tonight." The news spread from the porch to the street. A simple, astonishing revelation whispered from one person to another. The gilded cage was serving food that didn't taste burnt, in a town where sustenance was often a punishment. This was headline news. Jed McCrae had watched it all unfold from his quiet post across the street. He'd seen the men's reactions, seen the energy of the saloon shift on its axis. He finally pushed himself off the porch post and ambled across the dusty street, his spurs leaving small, deliberate puffs in the dirt. He didn't enter the raucous main room. Instead, he walked up to the side of the bar that faced the porch, where Martha often served drifters and men in a hurry. He took off his hat, revealing a brow damp with sweat, and placed a heavy silver dollar on the worn and wood. The coin rang with a clear, solid sound that cut through the low chatter. Martha looked up, her expression questioning. "A plate from the new cook," Jed said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Whatever she's making." He pushed the coin forward. "And a canteen of water for the kitchen." The request for water was what made Martha pause. No customer had ever bought a drink for the help. She stared at Jed for a moment, her gaze searching his calm, unreadable face. Without a word, she took the coin, filled a tin plate with the rich-smelling stew, and then took a clean canteen from a hook behind the bar and filled it with cool water from the barrel. She slid them both across the counter. Jed nodded his thanks. took the plate and the canteen, and retreated back to the porch, settling into a chair in the shadows to eat his meal. A few minutes later, Nora pushed the kitchen door open and limped toward the water pump in the alley. The brief respite between the first wave of orders and the impending supper rush was her only chance. The heat from the stove, combined with the relentless pace, had left her dizzy with exhaustion. Her hands trembled, a fine, persistent tremor she couldn't control, a frustrating betrayal by her own body. She worked the stiff iron handle of the pump, the squeal of the mechanism, a shrill complaint in the quiet alley. She leaned down, splashing the cold, shocking water onto her face and the back of her neck, trying to will the strength back into her limbs. "You should drink some of that." Jed's voice came from the shadows at the edge of the alley. He stepped forward, holding out the canteen Martha had filled. He moved without a sound, a large, quiet presence in the fading light. Nora straightened up, startled, her hand flying to her chest. She hadn't heard him approach. She looked from his face to the canteen he offered, her expression wary. "It's clean," he said, his voice gentle, from the barrel inside. She hesitated for only a second before reaching for it. Her trembling fingers brushed against his as she took the canteen. His hand was large and calloused, but the brief contact was unexpectedly warm, a small island of steady heat against her own chilled and shaking skin. It was a simple, fleeting touch, over in an instant, but it was the first moment of simple, undemanding kindness she had known in a very long time. From the kitchen window, Ruby saw the exchange. She saw the tall, quiet cowboy step out of the shadows. She saw him offer the canteen, and she saw the brief, almost imperceptible touch of their hands. Her eyes, which had been wide with surprise just moments before, narrowed into sharp, cold slits. A possessive fire, hot and ugly, flared in her chest. Jed McCrae was a prize, the quietest and most respected of the ranchers who frequented the saloon, and he rarely gave any of the saloon girls more than a polite nod. Ruby had been working to gain his attention for months. To see him offer this small courtesy to the limping, dirt-stained newcomer was an intolerable offense. She stormed out the back door, her silk dress a slash of angry red against the drab twilight. "Having a nice little chat?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She turned her sharpened gaze on Nora. "You're a good cook," she admitted, the words tasting like acid in her mouth. "I'll give you that." She took a step closer, invading Nora's space. "But the rules here don't change. Men come here for a drink and a smile. Remember your place." Nora did not flinch. She met Ruby's venomous glare with a quiet, steady resolve that was more powerful than any shouted retort. She capped the canteen and held it in her hands, her trembling having mysteriously subsided. "I came for the kitchen," Nora said, her voice low but carrying the unyielding weight of conviction. "Not for any man's eye." A hush seemed to fall over the alley, the world shrinking to the space between the two women. And at that exact moment, a strange thing happened. The low murmur of conversation from inside the saloon, which had been the backdrop to their confrontation, suddenly dwindled. The raucous laughter, the signature sound of "the gilded cage," seemed to shrink and then die out completely. It was impossible to say whether the men inside had overheard Nora's quiet, defiant words, or if it was simply the moment that the next round of her food, a second course of stew, hotter and richer than the first, had begun to arrive at their tables, silencing them with its simple, honest goodness. The silence that followed Nora's words in the alley was a thick, heavy thing, more potent than the shouting it had replaced. Ruby, for the first time, seemed to be without a ready retort. She stared at Nora, her painted smile frozen in a mask of disbelief, before spinning on her heel and stalking back into the saloon, the swish of her silk dress sounding like an angry hiss. Nora stood for a moment longer, the cool weight of the canteen a solid anchor in her trembling hands. Then, she too turned and went back to the heat and the work, back to the only world where she held any real power. Her mind, however, was not on the bubbling stew. The resentful glint in Ruby's eyes had dislodged a memory, a scene that played out behind her eyes as she stirred the pot. It was a memory of another place, a raw, wind-swept mining camp high in the mountains. The kitchen there had been a drafty tent, the stove a temperamental beast, but she had made it work. She had cooked for 24 hungry, hard-edged men, turning tough game and dried provisions into meals that quieted their rough-and-tumble natures for a few minutes each day. The foreman, a man with a wet mouth and small, greedy eyes, had praised her cooking. Then, one evening, after the last plate had been cleared, he had cornered her behind the supply wagon. His request was not for food. He spoke of company, of a woman's duties after the cooking was done. When Nora had refused, her voice as cold and hard as the mountain rock, his face had contorted in a sneer of wounded pride. The next morning, her pay was thrown at her feet, and her meager belongings, including her precious knives, were tossed onto the dusty ground. The supply wagon that brought her to the camp was leaving, and she was told in no uncertain terms that she would not be on it. They had cast her out, discarded her like a broken tool, because she had insisted on being only what she had been hired to be, a cook. That memory gave way to another, softer but sadder still. The face of her husband, Thomas, swam in her vision, his skin slick with the fever that had consumed him at a remote prospecting station a year before her disastrous stint at the mining camp. He had been a kind, quiet man with a dreamer's heart, always certain the next stream would hold their fortune. But the gold they sought remained hidden, and the fever had found him instead. She had tried to fight it with the only magic she knew, food. She'd tried to coax him back to life with broths and thin soups, her skills rendered useless against the relentless fire in his blood. Water had been scarce, the creek dwindling to a muddy trickle under the relentless sun. It was then that she had learned the desperate art of cooking with almost nothing, how to draw every last drop of flavor and substance from a handful of ingredients, how to make a soup that was more steam and hope than liquid. She had learned to create the illusion of plenty from the reality of want. It was a bitter lesson, and one that had not saved him. He died with her name on his lips, leaving her utterly alone with her pots and her grief. The familiar, deep ache in her left leg brought her back to the present with a jolt. She shifted her weight, the pain a constant, nagging companion. That, too, was a souvenir of her past. It had happened during a ferocious storm at a way station, the wind and rain lashing the plains. She had been trying to move a great cauldron of boiling water from the open fire to the relative shelter of a lean-to, to save it from being diluted by the downpour. The ground had turned to a slick, treacherous mud. Her foot slipped, and she went down hard. The cauldron tipped, and a wave of scalding water had missed her by inches. But her leg had twisted beneath her, the bone snapping with a sickening crack. She had lain there in the mud, in the rain, the storm raging around her, unable to move, calling for help until her voice was raw. But no one had come. The other travelers were too preoccupied with securing their own wagons and livestock to heed the cries of the cook. She had dragged herself to shelter, her world a universe of white-hot pain, and had set the bone herself as best she could. No one had held her hand. No one had brought her a cup of water. No one had helped. These were the ghosts that lived inside her, the invisible scars that shaped her every action, her discipline, her fierce, almost obsessive need to do her one job well, was not born of pride alone. It was the only order she could impose on a world that had shown her nothing but chaos and indifference. Every clean plate, every properly seasoned dish, every meal served hot and on time was a small act of defiance. It was a silent apology for the kindness the world had never offered her, a debt she paid to herself on behalf of everyone else. It was the only form of grace she knew how to create. And so, in the chaotic, grease-stained kitchen of the Gilded Cage, Nora began to create order, after the supper rush finally subsided, leaving behind a mountain of dirty dishes and a chorus of satisfied belches from the main room. She found Martha's ledger. It was a mess of haphazard scrawls, inventory listed as it was remembered, debts recorded in the margins. with no logic or system. Nora took a piece of charcoal from the stove and, on a clean page, began to impose a structure. She created columns, her handwriting neat and clear. Meat, beans, flour, salt, wood. It was a hierarchy of survival. The fundamental building blocks of any kitchen, from a royal palace to a grubby saloon. She was not just a cook, she was a quartermaster, and this was her first act of command. The next morning, she approached Martha, who was counting the previous night's impressive earnings. Nora did not waste time with pleasantries. She held up her right hand, showing the worn handle of her own paring knife and the mismatched, dull-edged implements that belonged to the saloon. "I can make do," she said, her voice even. "But I can work better." She laid out her terms, her voice quiet but unyielding. "I need 3 things. A whole cast-iron pot, one without cracks that I have to patch with flour paste, a proper chef's knife, one that can hold an edge, and a skillet that isn't warped and coated in rust." Martha looked up from her coins. Her eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. The woman had worked one night, and already she was making demands. It went against every instinct Martha had. "And who's going to pay for these fine things?" she sneered, her voice thick with sarcasm. "They don't grow on trees, you know." "My work will pay for them," Nora said simply. "It'll take you a month of Sundays to earn enough for a new pot, cooking beans and stew." Martha scoffed. "I'll put down a deposit." The voice came from the doorway. Jed McCrae stood there, his hat in his hands, his tall frame filling the opening. He had been listening from the porch. He stepped forward, not into the kitchen, but just over the threshold, a respectful distance. He looked at Martha, his gaze steady. "I'll cover the cost. Take it out of my credit." Martha's jaw dropped slightly. Jed was a man of few words and even fewer frivolous gestures. For him to make such an offer, to stand up for the new cook, was unheard of. A dozen calculations flickered behind her eyes. Keeping the cook happy might mean keeping customers like Jed McCrae happy, and that was good for business. But before Martha could agree, Nora shook her head, a small, firm gesture. She looked directly at Jed, her eyes holding a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, but her words were resolute. "No," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I thank you for the offer, sir, but I don't take money from customers." The line was drawn, clear and absolute. She was the cook. He was the customer. To accept his money would be to accept a different kind of arrangement, to blur the boundary she had fought so hard and lost so much. To maintain, it would make her indebted, and she would be indebted to no one. Jed held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the history in her eyes, the unbending principle forged in fires she had survived alone. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply understood. He gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod of respect, turned without another word, and walked away. Ruby, who had been watching the entire scene from the shadows of the main room, saw him leave. She watched his broad back disappear down the street, and a cold knot of fear and resentment tightened in her stomach. She had seen him look at Nora. It wasn't the way a man looked at a woman he wanted to flirt with. It was the way a man looked at something he respected, something he found rare and valuable. In that moment, Ruby sensed a profound shift in the landscape of her world. Her own power, built on practiced smiles, witty banter, and the strategic display of her charms, suddenly seemed fragile, a currency that was rapidly losing its value. This quiet, limping woman, with her scarred hands and a refusal to play the game, was somehow stealing the stage without ever setting foot on it. That night, there was no bed for Nora. Martha, not yet fully convinced, had offered her no more than the job. So Nora found her own accommodation. She unrolled a thin bedroll in the cramped, dark larder, the air thick with the dusty, wholesome smells of cornmeal and burlap. She lay down with her back against a large sack of dried beans, the lumpy texture a strange and unfamiliar comfort. Through the thin wooden door, she could hear the sounds of the saloon winding down for the night, the final, mournful notes of the piano, the scrape of chairs, the slurred goodnights of the last customers. She lay there in the dark, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in her bones. But she did not sleep. Her eyes remained open, staring into the blackness, listening. She was a stranger in a strange land, a lone soldier in a fragile truce. And she knew, with the certainty of long and bitter experience, that she had to stay awake, to listen for the sound of shifting alliances and approaching danger. The quiet that had settled over the gilded cage was shattered 3 days later by a sound like low, rolling thunder. It began as a distant rumble and grew steadily into a cacophony of hooves, cracking whips, and the raw-throated shouts of men. A cattle drive, dust-caked and trail-weary, was descending upon Harmony Creek. A dozen riders, their faces burned to the color of old leather and their clothes stiff with grime, swung down from their horses in front of the saloon. They moved as one organism, a wave of loud, boisterous, and profoundly hungry energy that crashed through the swinging doors. They were a storm of noise and motion. They pounded the bar for whiskey, their voices booming in the small space, and their demands for food were immediate and non-negotiable. They didn't want fancy. They wanted fast, hot, and plentiful. It was the ultimate trial by fire for Nora's fledgling kitchen, a test far greater than a few plates of beans for the town regulars. Martha's eyes gleamed with a mixture of avarice and anxiety as she took their orders, shouting them through the service window to Nora. 12 plates, meat, and make it quick. These boys have money to spend. Nora felt the familiar, cold knot of pressure tighten in her gut. She had known this moment would come. A saloon on a main trail lived or died by its ability to feed a crew like this. She took a deep breath and turned to the stove, her ally in this fight. But a quick look in the coal scuttle sent a jolt of alarm through her. It was nearly empty. The last delivery was late, and in the relative quiet of the past few days, she hadn't anticipated this sudden, overwhelming demand. For a moment, a flicker of panic threatened to take hold. An army had arrived at her gates, and her ammunition was nearly gone. She quickly suppressed the fear, her mind racing, adapting. Survival was about improvisation. She grabbed the wood axe from its hook by the back door, an axe usually reserved for splitting logs for the main hearth. She hauled a section of a thick pine log onto the chopping block and began to work with a fierce, focused energy. The axe rose and fell, the sharp crack of the blade splitting the wood echoing in the small kitchen. She didn't aim for large, slow-burning logs. She needed heat, and she needed it now. She split the wood into small, thin pieces of kindling, her arms and back protesting the unaccustomed strain. Sweat beaded on her forehead, tracing clean paths through the grime on her skin and stinging her eyes. With a pile of kindling ready, she carefully fed the pieces into the stove's firebox, layering them over the dwindling bed of coals. The wood caught quickly, but it produced a flame that was bright but lacked the deep, consistent heat of a proper coal fire. She needed more. She remembered an old trick from a camp cook who had lost his bellows. She found a length of hollow iron pipe, a piece of some long-forgotten plumbing, lying in the alley. After wiping it clean, she knelt before the open stove door, the searing heat washing over her face. She placed one end of the pipe near the base of the new flames and blew through the other, her cheeks puffing out with the effort. A targeted stream of air shot into the firebox, and the flames roared in response, turning from a flickering yellow to a brilliant, hissing white. She had to repeat the process every few minutes, a grueling, lung-bursting task that left her lightheaded and gasping for breath. But the temperature of the stove began to climb. Her face was flushed, her dress was soaked with sweat. But she had her heat. The fire was hers to command. The main dish had to be simple, hearty, and fast. The saloon had received a shipment of beef that morning, a tough, sinewy cut that would normally require hours of slow stewing. She had no time for that. With the new knife that had mysteriously appeared on her doorstep the morning after her conversation with Jed, a perfectly balanced, razor-sharp instrument she knew could have only come from him, she began to break down the meat. Her blade moved with blinding speed, slicing the beef against the grain into thin, almost transparent strips. This was the secret. Thin slices would cook in minutes, the heat searing the meat and locking in its juices before it had a chance to turn tough. She threw a large knob of lard into her biggest skillet, the clean gray steel she had personally scoured back to life. As it melted, she chopped a mountain of onions, the sharp fumes making her eyes water, the tears mixing with the sweat on her cheeks. She tossed the beef into the screaming hot pan. The sizzle was explosive, a sound that filled the kitchen and spilled out into the saloon. This was another part of the trick, a cheap and effective way to build flavor where there were no spices to be found. She let the meat sit for a moment, not stirring, allowing the edges to catch and char slightly on the hot iron. That small bit of charring, just shy of burning, would release a deep, smoky, almost sweet flavor that would transform the tough cut of meat into something delicious. She added the onions, stirring everything together, the kitchen filling with a mouth-watering aroma of seared beef and caramelized onions. Alongside the main dish, she worked on a massive batch of corn cakes, her hands moving automatically, and set a huge pot of coffee to brew, making it thick, black, and strong enough to wake the dead. The first plates went out, and the effect on the cattle crew was immediate and profound. The wall of noise in the saloon didn't just quiet down, it ceased to exist, replaced by the earnest, focused sounds of men eating with genuine pleasure. But not all the men were at the tables. One of them, a burly man with a flushed face and unsteady feet, had consumed more whiskey than was wise on an empty stomach. He peeled away from his group and began to wander, his curiosity piqued by the incredible smells coming from the back. He stumbled through the doorway into the kitchen, a lopsided grin on his face. He leaned against the door frame, his bulk blocking the only exit, and looked Nora up and down. "Well now," he slurred, his eyes lingering on her flushed face and sweat-soaked dress. "Look what we have here, the little cook behind all this good grub. You smell almost as good as your food, darling." Nora didn't stop moving. She flinched inwardly, a cold dread washing over her. But her outward demeanor remained a mask of detached concentration. She took one deliberate step back, putting the corner of the heavy work table between them. Her hand, however, never stopped stirring the pan on the stove. Her eyes never left the food. To look at him would be to engage, to acknowledge his intrusion into her sanctuary. She would not give him that. From her position near the service window, Ruby watched the scene unfold, her expression a strange cocktail of emotions. A part of her, the part that saw Nora as a rival, felt a flicker of cruel satisfaction. This was the reality of their world, the price a woman often had to pay, and it was a lesson she thought the proud new cook needed to learn. But another part of her, a smaller, more deeply buried part, felt a pang of solidarity, of fear. She had been in Nora's position 100 times, fending off unwanted advances with a forced smile and a quick retreat. She saw the man's leering eyes and Nora's rigid posture, and for a moment, she half wished she could intervene, half wished she could watch him take Nora down a peg. She was frozen by her own internal conflict. She didn't have to decide. A shadow fell across the kitchen doorway. Jed McCrae had been sitting quietly on the porch, nursing a beer. When he saw the drunken drover wander toward the kitchen, he had seen the look on the man's face. Jed moved with a speed that was startling in a man his size. He didn't rush or shout. He simply entered the kitchen, a figure of quiet, implacable authority. He walked up behind the drunk and placed a large, heavy hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a violent gesture, but the weight and firmness of it were unmistakable. The drunk man flinched, startled, and turned to find himself looking into Jed's cold, gray eyes. "Outside," Jed said. His voice was a low rumble, barely above a whisper, but it carried the absolute finality of a closing cell door. The drunk man's bravado evaporated instantly. He stammered an apology, his face paling, and practically scrambled out of the kitchen, melting back into the crowd. Jed didn't spare him a second glance. He looked at Nora, who was still standing by the stove, her knuckles white where she gripped the skillet's handle. He gave her a short, single nod, a silent acknowledgement of the crisis averted. And then he, too, was gone, retreating back to the shadows of the porch as quietly as he had appeared. When the last of the cattle crew had finally pushed back their chairs, their bellies full and their spirits mellowed by good food, they paid their tabs generously. Martha stood behind the bar, counting a stack of coins and bills that was significantly larger than any she had seen on a single night. She watched the drovers leave, their usual grumbling replaced by loud praise for the meal. She looked at the stacks of plates by the service window, every single one scraped clean. Something in her, a hard, cynical knot she had carried for years, began to soften. She walked back to the kitchen, where Nora was methodically beginning to clean the mountain of greasy pots and pans, her movements slow and heavy with exhaustion. "You can stay," Martha said, her voice gruff, lacking any real warmth but stripped of its earlier hostility. "I'll pay you by the week." Nora stopped scrubbing. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron, and met the older woman's gaze. She nodded once, accepting the offer, but she had a condition. Her trial was over, and now it was her turn to set the terms. "I'll stay," she said, her voice steady despite her fatigue. "But the kitchen must be kept clean, and the cook must be left in peace." A dry, rasping sound came from the doorway. It was Ruby, who had been listening. She let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a brittle, cynical sound. "Peace," she said, shaking her head as she picked up a tray of empty glasses. "In the West, honey, peace is the rarest thing there is." Nora didn't reply. She simply turned back to her work. Later that night, long after the saloon had fallen silent, she found a flat, smooth piece of pine wood that had been discarded from a broken crate, with a piece of charcoal from the cold stove. She carefully wrote out her first official menu. The letters were stark and black against the pale wood. There were no fancy descriptions or flowery names. There were only 3 words, a promise and a declaration of principle. It read, simple, hot, salted right. The nature of Nora's success was a peculiar thing, and it bred a new kind of attention. The Gilded Cage was busier than ever, its tables full most nights. But the atmosphere had changed. The honest, simple quality of her food had become a local curiosity, and by extension, so had she. A rumor, born from her silence and her refusal to engage in the customary saloon banter, began to circulate. It was whispered over laundry lines, and across the bar the new cook was proud. She was stuck up, some said, a woman who thought herself too good to smile or trade pleasantries. The rumor, paradoxically, drew even larger crowds. Men came not just for the satisfying heat of her stew, but for the spectacle of the woman who made it. They would place their orders with Ruby, then angle their chairs just so, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious figure through the service window. They watched her move in the flickering lamplight of the kitchen, a silhouette of tireless motion, and interpreted her focused efficiency as arrogance. They tried to draw her out, calling out compliments laced with challenges. "Food's mighty fine. Cook almost as fine as a smile would be." Nora never responded. She heard them. Of course. She felt their collective gaze as a physical pressure, a familiar weight on her shoulders. But she had long ago learned that engaging with such talk was like trying to douse a fire with oil. Her silence was her shield, her kitchen her fortress, and she retreated deeper into its smoky embrace. This new dynamic did not go unnoticed by the women of Harmony Creek. At first, they were suspicious, repeating the gossip they heard from their husbands, but then curiosity won over. One afternoon, a woman Nora recognized as the blacksmith's wife, a sturdy figure with kind eyes and arms corded with muscle, appeared at the kitchen's back door. Her name was Eleanor Gable, and she held out a small bundle wrapped in a damp cloth. "These came out of my garden this morning," she said, her voice straightforward. Without preamble, she unwrapped the cloth to reveal a half-dozen small, sweet-smelling turnips, their skins still traced with the dark. rich earth they had grown in. Thought they might be good in the stew. Nora looked from the woman's face to the offering. Eleanor's hands, like her own, were not delicate. They were chapped and capable. The hands of someone who worked. This was not a flirtatious offering from a man seeking to buy her attention. Nor was it a test. It was a gift of labor, a recognition from one working woman to another, a gesture of simple, unadorned respect. Nora reached out and took one of the turnips, its cool, solid weight a comfort in her palm. And then, something unexpected happened. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of Nora's mouth. It was a fragile, fleeting thing, gone almost as soon as it appeared. But it was genuine. It was the first true smile she had offered since arriving in this town. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. "They will be." Eleanor Gable simply nodded, as if a great and important transaction had been completed, and left. Nora held the turnip for a moment longer before placing it on her cutting board, a small, earthy promise of kindness in her harsh world. Kindness, she was learning, came in different forms. The next morning, when she unbarred the back door to greet the gray dawn, she found something resting on the threshold. It was one of her own knives, a tired, dull-bladed utility knife she had brought with her in her canvas satchel, but it was not the same. She picked it up. The wooden handle had been sanded smooth, the small nicks and scratches erased, and the wood treated with some kind of oil that brought out its dark grain. The blade itself had been transformed. It had been expertly honed on a whetstone, its edge now lethally sharp and gleaming in the morning light. She ran her thumb carefully over the flat of the blade, then tested the edge on a sliver of her fingernail. It was perfect. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but she knew. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones. It was Jed's work. It was his silent answer to her refusal of his money. He had not bought her a new tool, which would have felt like charity. He had taken something that was hers and made it better, an act of service that respected her ownership and her pride. She took the restored knife into her kitchen, the cool steel a reassuring weight in her hand. No words of thanks were necessary. None were expected. The gesture was a conversation in itself, one she understood completely. Ruby saw everything. From her perch behind the bar, she had a clear view of the saloon's ecosystem, and she was an expert at reading its subtle shifts and currents. She saw the men watch Nora. She saw the women, like Eleanor Gable, begin to approach the kitchen with small offerings. And most of all, she saw Jed McCrae. She saw the way his quiet gaze would often drift toward the kitchen, the way he would sit on the porch, nursing a single beer for an hour, as if standing guard. One evening, the saloon was particularly crowded. Ruby was in her element, her laughter bright as she moved between the tables, her scarlet dress a beacon in the smoky room. She deftly poured a round of whiskeys for a table of boisterous miners, letting her hand linger for a moment on one of their shoulders, a small, practiced gesture that earned her a few extra coins. As she straightened up, her eyes scanned the room, automatically seeking out Jed. He was there, sitting alone at the far end of the bar, but he wasn't looking at her. He wasn't watching her performance at all. His gaze was fixed on the service window, his expression thoughtful, distant. He was watching the shadows move in Nora's kitchen. In that instant, the bright, artificial light in Ruby's eyes went out, replaced by a cold, hard flatness. Her smile remained perfectly in place, a painted mask, but behind it, her heart felt like a small, cold stone. A few nights later, disaster struck in a small but violent way. Nora was rendering a large piece of beef fat, the clear, liquid tallow destined for making soap and candles. A sudden commotion from the main room, a chair crashing over. A man shouting drew her attention for a single, fatal second. In that moment, the fat in the pan overheated, reached its flash point, and erupted in a column of greasy, orange flame that shot toward the low, soot-stained ceiling. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her body reacted with the speed of pure instinct, a drill she had unknowingly rehearsed in a dozen other crises. She grabbed a heavy burlap sack that lay nearby, plunged it into the barrel of dishwater, and, without hesitating, flung the soaking, heavy cloth over the flaming skillet. The fire let out an angry, hissing roar. At the same time, she grabbed the heavy iron lid for the pan and slammed it down on top of the wet sack, starving the fire of the air it needed to breathe. The flames vanished, leaving behind a thick cloud of acrid, black smoke and the stench of burnt grease. The kitchen was safe. The fire was out. But as the adrenaline began to recede, a searing, white-hot pain bloomed in her right hand. In her haste, the back of her hand had connected with the glowing red edge of the cast-iron skillet. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from crying out, stumbling to the water barrel and plunging her injured hand into the cool water. The relief was immediate, but temporary. When she pulled her hand out, the skin was an angry, alarming red, already beginning to puff up in a series of painful-looking blisters. The back door opened, and Jed stepped inside. He had seen the flash of the fire from the porch and had come to investigate. He took in the scene at a glance: the smoky air, the covered skillet on the stove, and Nora standing by the water barrel, her face pale and drawn with pain. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She couldn't bring herself to look at him. "It's nothing," she said, her voice tight. "I'm fine." He ignored her words and gently took her arm, turning her injured hand toward the light. He winced at the sight of the burn. Without another word, he turned and rummaged through a supply crate, emerging a moment later with a roll of clean linen bandaging and a small tin of salve. He guided her to a stool and knelt before her. His hands, she noticed, were large and calloused, crisscrossed with the scars of a life spent handling rope, wood, and iron. They seemed far too big and rough for such a delicate task. His movements were clumsy, uncertain, but his touch was incredibly gentle as he carefully applied the soothing salve to the angry burn and then loosely wrapped the hand in the clean linen. He worked in silence, his brow furrowed in concentration. The quiet intimacy of the moment was unsettling to Nora, a breach of the carefully constructed walls she kept around herself. "I don't need your pity," she whispered, the words sharp with a pain that had nothing to do with her hand. It was an old, reflexive defense, the raising of a shield that had protected her for years. Jed finished tying off the bandage and looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. His expression was serious, without a trace of the condescension she expected. "I'm not bringing pity to your kitchen, Nora," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm bringing a bandage. There's a difference." A heavy sigh came from the main doorway. Martha stood there, a tray of empty glasses in her hands. Having witnessed the entire exchange, she looked from Jed's kneeling form to Nora's pale, defiant face, and a look of profound weariness crossed her features. "If you intend to stay here, girl," she said, her voice more tired than harsh, "you're going to have to learn to endure the talk of the world." Nora looked down at her bandaged hand, then back at the stove, her silent, formidable ally. She had faced its fire and won. She thought of the whispers, the stares, Ruby's cold eyes, and the unwanted advances of men. She had endured them all. She raised her chin, her gaze clear and unwavering as she met Martha's eyes. "I can handle fire," Nora said, her voice low and steady. Words are not nearly as hot. A wave of civic pride, a sentiment as rare and precious as a summer rain, swept through Harmony Creek. The town council, in a burst of uncharacteristic ambition, announced the first ever Founders' Day fair. There would be horse races, a strongman competition, and various games of chance, but the centerpiece of the fundraising efforts for the new town chapel was to be a cooking competition. It was an event designed to bring the community together, to celebrate the hearth as the heart of the home. When Ruby heard the news, a slow, malicious smile spread across her face. It was the perfect opportunity, a public stage on which to finally unmask the town's celebrated cook. She found her mother poring over the saloon's accounts, a deep frown etched on her face. "Ma," Ruby began, her voice a carefully calibrated blend of feigned enthusiasm and cunning. "You should enter the saloon in that cooking competition." Martha snorted without looking up. "And who would do the cooking, you? You'd burn water." "No, not me," Ruby said, leaning against the bar. "Her, Nora." She let the name hang in the air. "Think of the prestige. If she wins, the Gilded Cage will be the most famous establishment for 50 miles. People will come from all over. It's good for business." Martha paused, her pen hovering over the ledger. The business angle was a powerful lure. And if she loses? Ruby's smile tightened. "Then everyone will see she's just a one-trick pony who can make a decent stew and nothing more. The talk will stop. She'll be put back in her place." It was a perfect trap, with victory for Ruby no matter the outcome. Either Nora's humiliation or the saloon's glory would serve her purposes. Martha, seduced by the prospect of increased profits, eventually agreed. She informed Nora of the decision not as a request, but as an order. Nora, whose only desire was to be left in peace in her kitchen, felt a familiar weariness, but to refuse would be seen as cowardice, an admission of the very fraud Ruby was hoping to expose. Her professional pride, the only thing she had left in the world, would not allow it. She simply nodded, her jaw tight with resolve. The day of the fair was a maelstrom of dust, noise, and color. The entire town had turned out, their drab daily attire replaced by Sunday best. The cooking competition was set up in a row of makeshift stalls near the half-finished frame of the new chapel. Nora's primary opponent was immediately obvious. He was a chef from the newly opened Wayfarer's Inn at the other end of town. A portly man named Antoine who preened in a ridiculously white apron. His stall was a testament to ostentation. He had gleaming copper pots, a row of German-made knives, and, most impressively, a locked wooden chest from which he produced a dozen small, exotic-smelling tins of spices. He made a great show of unlocking the chest, wafting the fragrant air toward the gathering crowd. Nora's station, by contrast, was a model of Spartan utility. She had her one good knife, her trusted iron skillet, a heavy stew pot, and a pile of dry, seasoned wood for her small, portable brazier. The rules of the competition, read out by the mayor, were simple and, for Antoine, deeply frustrating. In honor of the town's pioneering spirit, the ingredients were to be limited to what a family on the trail might have carried in their wagon flour: dried beans, salt pork, onions, and whatever wild herbs they could forage from the surrounding prairie. The dishes would be judged on 3 criteria: aroma, flavor, and, most importantly, the ability to warm the soul. As the competition began, Antoine, robbed of his exotic spices, put on a show of technical skill, dicing his onions with theatrical flair and arranging his ingredients with the finicky precision of a watchmaker. Nora ignored him. She had her own plan: a simple but satisfying cornbread made with rendered salt pork, and a rich, slow-simmered bean soup. This was the food of survival, the food she knew in her bones. She reached for the sack of flour provided by the competition organizers, the very foundation of her dish. But as she untied the string, her hand paused. A faint, almost imperceptible smell reached her, a scent that was fundamentally wrong. It was a damp, musty odor, the sour, bitter smell of rot and decay. She leaned closer, her heart sinking. It was the unmistakable scent of moldy flour. She glanced up, and for a fleeting second, her eyes met Ruby's across the crowd. Ruby was standing beside her mother, a look of serene, triumphant innocence on her face. In that instant, Nora understood everything. This was not a competition. It was an execution, and the axe had already fallen. A cold wave of panic washed over her. She could protest, accuse Ruby, but who would believe her? It would be her word against the saloon owner's daughter. They would call her a sore loser, a fraud making excuses. She was trapped. For a moment, All the old ghosts returned the foreman's sneer, the lonely agony of her broken leg, the helpless grief by her husband's bedside. The world seemed to shrink, the sounds of the fair fading to a dull roar. Then, the instinct for survival, honed by years of hardship, took over. She would not be broken here. She would not give them the satisfaction. With a quiet, deliberate movement, she retied the sack of spoiled flour and pushed it to the very back of her stall. She would not use it. She would not touch it. She would start again. Her mind raced, taking a frantic inventory of her remaining, pathetic resources. The dried beans, the small chunk of salt pork, the onions. It wasn't enough. She needed something more, something to build a dish around. Her eyes scanned the edge of the fairgrounds, where the prairie grass began. And then she saw it, a small, gnarled bush with pale, gray-green leaves, wild sage, and near the butcher's stall, she saw a bucket of discarded beef bones, scraps deemed unworthy of sale. A new plan, desperate and defiant, formed in her mind. She walked quickly to the butcher, who gave her a quizzical look but allowed her to take a few of the bones for free. She gathered a handful of the wild sage, crushing a leaf between her fingers. The sharp, clean, medicinal scent filled her nostrils. It was the scent of the wilderness, the scent of resilience. This would be her weapon. She returned to her station and began to work with a new, ferocious intensity. She used the back of her axe to crack the beef bones, exposing the rich marrow within. She put them in her pot with water and onions to create a quick, intensely flavorful broth. She sorted through the dried beans, picking them over with a practiced eye. This was her new dish, a simple, elemental soup of bone broth and beans, a meal made from nothing but scraps and ingenuity to deepen the flavor. She employed another trick learned in times of scarcity. She took a handful of coarse salt and threw it into her dry, hot skillet. She toasted it, stirring constantly, until the crystals began to turn a faint, golden brown. The process cooked off the salt's harsh, chemical bite, leaving behind a softer, nuttier, more complex flavor. This, along with the crushed wild sage, would be her only seasoning. She coaxed her small fire, feeding it slivers of wood, nursing it to the perfect temperature. The broth began to simmer, and a away, deeply comforting aroma began to rise from her pot. A scent that was entirely different from the fussy, technical smells coming from Antoine's station. It smelled of earth and fire and wild, open spaces. Just as the soup was reaching its peak, a sudden, powerful gust of wind swept across the fairgrounds, kicking up a cloud of dust and sending hats tumbling. The crowd murmured in annoyance. But for Nora, it was a catastrophe. The wind hit her exposed brazier, and in an instant, her carefully nurtured fire was extinguished, leaving behind only a plume of gray smoke and a few sullen, dying embers. A collective gasp went through the small group of onlookers watching her. It was over. Without fire, she was finished. But then, a large shadow fell over her station. Jed McCrae had been watching from the edge of the crowd, his face grim. He had seen her discard the flour, had watched her improvise with a growing sense of admiration. Now, he saw her fire go out. Without a word, he moved. He stepped behind her stall and simply stood there, his tall, broad frame acting as a human windbreak. He positioned himself against the prevailing wind, his body a solid, unmoving wall, creating a pocket of calm in the midst of the gale. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He just stood there, a silent, steadfast guardian. Nora looked up at his back, at the solid set of his shoulders, and in that moment, she understood that she was no longer entirely alone, bolstered by his silent presence. She turned back to the brazier. She knelt, just as she had done in the saloon kitchen, and blew a long, steady breath onto the embers, shielded from the wind. They glowed, caught the kindling, and burst back into flame. When the time came for the judging, Antoine presented his dish first. It was a perfectly cooked piece of salt pork resting on a bed of finely minced beans and onions. garnished with a single, artfully placed parsley leaf he had miraculously procured. The judges, 3 of the town's elderly matriarchs and the old, retired town doctor, tasted it. They nodded, murmuring words like excellent texture and well executed. But their faces were impassive. It was food that spoke to the head, not the heart. Then it was Nora's turn. She had no fancy platter. She simply ladled her humble soup into 3 clean tin bowls. The aroma reached the judges before the bowls did. A rich, savory scent of bone broth and wild sage. The head judge, Dr. Abernathy, a man who had come west in a covered wagon 50 years earlier, picked up his spoon. He paused, the spoon halfway to his mouth, and simply inhaled. A strange, faraway look came into his eyes. He took a single spoonful. He didn't comment on the texture or the technique. He set the spoon down, and the other judges were startled to see that his eyes had become misty. His voice, when he spoke, was a hoarse, cracked whisper. "My wife. We spent our first winter here in a canvas tent," he said, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from the bowl. "A norther came through, tore a hole in the roof. We thought we would freeze." He looked up, his eyes meeting Nora's across the table. "This," he said, his voice thick with a lifetime of memory. "This is the smell of a warm tent after a storm has passed." The contest was over. There was no grand announcement, no loud applause. When the mayor declared Nora the winner, the crowd didn't erupt in cheers. Instead, a low, collective sigh seemed to pass through the weary, work-worn people. It was a sigh of recognition, of understanding. They didn't just taste the soup. They tasted the hardship it represented, the resilience it celebrated. It was a victory not of skill, but of substance. Nora simply stood by her stall, her hands resting on the rough wooden surface. In the midst of the quiet congratulations, she saw Ruby. The younger woman was standing stock still, her face a pale, frozen mask of shock. The public humiliation she had engineered had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. For a long, silent moment, she just stared at Nora, all the color drained from her face. Then, the mask cracked. A brittle, jarring sound escaped her lips, not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. She shook her head, a look of bitter, unwilling admiration in her eyes. "Well, I'll be," she said, her voice a harsh whisper that was almost carried away by the wind. "You're good. Cook, you're really good." Nora's victory at the fair did not bring peace. It brought the opposite. Fame, in a town as small and brittle as Harmony Creek, was a currency that bred as much resentment as it did respect. The gilded cage was now the undisputed heart of the town's social life. Every evening, its tables were filled with men and, increasingly, families, who came for the simple, honest food that tasted of a home they had either lost or never known. The sound of laughter in the saloon was richer, the arguments less sharp, the entire establishment softened by the civilizing influence of a well-fed belly. This success cast a long, cold shadow over the other end of the street, where the Wayfarers' Inn stood in increasingly splendid isolation. Antoine, the preening chef, now cooked his technically perfect but soulless meals for a mostly empty room. The jealousy festered, turning from a professional rivalry into a sour, personal hatred. He began to see Nora not as a competitor, but as the sole author of his humiliation. And in the dark, resentful corners of the West, wounded pride often sought its remedy in violence. The first attack was crude, a coward's assault in the dead of night. Nora was asleep in the larder, her body a tight knot of exhaustion, when a sound like a gunshot shattered the silence. It was the sharp, percussive crack of a rock smashing through the kitchen window. She was on her feet in an instant, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hand reaching for the heavy iron skillet that was never far from her side. Another rock followed, thudding against the wooden wall, and then the sound of running feet fading into the darkness. She stood there in the blackness, listening to the cold night air whisper through the broken pane of glass, her anger a cold, hard stone in her stomach. In the morning, She found the two rocks lying amidst the shattered glass. A clear and unambiguous message. The vandalism put Martha in a state of high alarm. This was no drunken brawl. This was a targeted attack on her property, on her business. Her newfound appreciation for Nora's cooking was quickly overshadowed by her deep-seated aversion to trouble. That afternoon, she cornered Nora while she was sweeping up the last of the glass. "I've had an offer," Martha began, her voice all business. "A big mining syndicate up in the Black Hills. They're setting up a permanent camp. Need a contract cook for 100 men. Good pay. Secure." Nora paused, leaning on the broom. She understood immediately. This wasn't an offer. It was a solution to Martha's problem. "You want to sell me," she said, her voice flat. "It's not selling," Martha snapped, though she couldn't quite meet Nora's eyes. "It's a contract, a transfer of services. It would be a good position for you. Nora, safe, no more broken windows, no more trouble." The unspoken words hung in the air. "Take the trouble with you when you go." Before Nora could formulate a response, another offer of escape was presented, this one wrapped in a silken, deceptive package. Ruby approached her later that day, her face a mask of manufactured sympathy. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice a soft coo. "It's terrible. You don't deserve this." She pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Nora's hand. "It's a stagecoach ticket, all the way back east, if you like. I cashed in a few favors. Consider it a gift, a way out of this awful mess. You shouldn't have to put up with this." The gesture was perfect, the words flawless. But Nora saw the flicker of triumph in Ruby's eyes, the barely concealed eagerness for her to accept, to simply disappear and restore the old order. That evening, as Nora was preparing to start the supper service, Jed appeared at the back door. He didn't speak at first, his gaze taking in the board that now covered the broken window, the tension in Nora's shoulders. He knew about the attack, and he knew Martha. He could guess the conversations that had taken place. "I have a place," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the day's anxiety. "My ranch. It's not fancy, but it's quiet. The kitchen is clean. The wind is good." He paused, his gray eyes searching her face. You would be safe there. It was the most tempting offer of all. She pictured it in her mind, a clean kitchen of her own, the open sky, the absence of leering eyes and broken glass, safety, peace. For a heart-stopping moment, she allowed herself to feel the profound, bone-deep weariness, the longing to simply lay down her weapons and accept his protection. But then she thought of the price. To go with him would be to become his responsibility, his dependent. She would be the rancher's cook, her identity subsumed by his, after a lifetime of fighting to stand on her own 2 feet, however damaged one of them was. She could not bring herself to lean on anyone else, no matter how strong or kind. She looked down at her scarred hands, the tools of her independence. "I appreciate the offer, Jed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her eyes filled with a sad, unbending resolve. "But I don't follow anyone." Jed held her gaze, and in the long, silent moment that followed, he seemed to understand everything. He saw not a rejection of him, but an affirmation of herself. He nodded slowly, a deep respect dawning in his eyes, and then he turned and left as quietly as he had come. Nora was alone again, besieged from all sides, but the offers of escape, however well-intentioned or malicious, had clarified her position. She would not be sold, she would not be tricked, and she would not be saved. She would stand her ground. She took a piece of chalk from the ledger desk and, on the raw pine board that now served as her window, she wrote a new message to the town, a new rule for her kitchen. The letters were bold and clear, kitchens open. It read, "Troublemakers will eat salt for a week." Her defiance did not quell the hostility. It only forced it to change tactics. Antoine, realizing that direct violence had failed, began a campaign of character assassination. He and his cronies spread vile, Insidious rumors through the town that Nora was a drunk, that her kitchen was unclean, that she had been run out of a dozen other towns for theft. The poison seeped into the community's bloodstream. Soon, small children, with the thoughtless cruelty of youth, would gather on the porch outside the kitchen, chanting nasty rhymes they had learned from their parents. "Nora Lane! Nora Lane! What's that crawling in your grain?" they would taunt, their high-pitched voices like the stinging of wasps. Nora heard it all. She would bite down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood, her hands tightening on her knife. And she would keep cooking. The steady rhythm of chopping, the hiss of the skillet, the bubbling of the pot, this was her answer, her prayer, her shield against the ugliness of the world. One night, the attack she had been dreading finally came, but not in the way she had expected. She awoke in the larder to a faint scraping sound. She lay perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. Listening, it was the sound of the larder's outer door being pried open. She reached for her skillet, her heart pounding a slow, heavy drumbeat of fear and rage. She expected to see the hulking forms of Antoine's hired thugs. The door creaked open, and a small, slender shadow slipped inside. It moved quickly, stealthily, toward the sacks of flour and beans. In the faint moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the wall, Nora saw the intruder. It was not a man. It was a boy, no more than 13 or 14. His clothes little more than rags, his movements quick and desperate like a starving coyote. He was stuffing a small sack with handfuls of dried beans. As he turned to leave, his foot slipped in a patch of mud on the floor, leaving behind a small, perfect footprint. All the fight went out of Nora. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a vast, hollow ache. This wasn't an act of malice. This wasn't Antoine's war. This was hunger. Her enemy wasn't a man. It was the gnawing desperation of an empty belly. She remained hidden until the boy had gone. And then she slowly got to her feet. She looked at the spilled beans on the floor and the small, muddy footprint. And she saw not a crime, but a plea. She did not call the sheriff. She did not tell Martha. Instead, she lit a small lamp and went to work. She took out her largest pot and filled it with water, beans, and the last of the beef bones. She built a slow fire and let the soup simmer for hours, its rich, life-giving aroma filling the dark, silent kitchen. Just before dawn, when the soup was thick and fragrant, she ladled it into a large, covered bucket. She carried it outside and placed it on the back step, right next to the small, muddy footprint, on a scrap of paper. She wrote a simple message in charcoal and tucked it under the bucket's handle. The note read, "If you are hungry, eat, but do not kill the kitchen." The next morning, the bucket was gone. The rumor mill began to grind to a halt. The children no longer gathered on the porch to chant their cruel rhymes. The story of the soup, whispered from one hungry mouth to another, began to circulate, a quiet antidote to Antoine's poison. Nora's act of defiance had been to meet violence with a threat, but her act of true power had been to meet desperation with compassion. A few days later, she opened the back door in the pre-dawn gloom to find a small, neatly stacked pile of firewood on her doorstep. The day after that, a burlap sack containing a few pounds of dried beans appeared. The following morning, it was a small, clean tin of salt. There were never any notes. No one ever claimed credit, but Nora understood. The silent offerings were a new kind of conversation, a new kind of truce. She had fed one of her enemies, and in doing so, had earned the protection of a silent, grateful army. The kitchen was still her fortress, but she was no longer its only guard. The sky over Harmony Creek had been a bruised, sullen purple all afternoon, the air thick and heavy with an oppressive humidity that promised violence. The storm broke just after sunset, not with a cleansing rain, but with a sudden, furious assault. The wind came first, a malevolent howl that ripped at the saloon sign and sent dust devils dancing down the empty street. Then came the rain, hard, driving pellets that hammered against the roof and turned the windows to milky, streaming sheets of gray. Inside the gilded cage. The storm was a welcome excuse for another round of drinks. The room was crowded, the air warm and thick with the smells of wet wool, whiskey, and Nora's simmering beef stew. The roar of the storm outside was a distant counterpoint to the boisterous laughter and the frantic, cheerful notes of the piano. It was a pocket of light and warmth carved out of the raging darkness. Then the world turned white. A jagged spear of lightning, impossibly bright and close, tore through the sky, followed not by a rumble of thunder, but by a single, deafening crack that sounded like the world splitting in two. The lamps in the saloon flickered wildly, and every man in the room froze, his drink halfway to his lips. The sound was immediately followed by the splintering shriek of tortured wood, and, a moment later, a new and terrifying light began to bloom in the darkness behind the saloon, a hungry, flickering orange that painted the rain-streaked windows in hellish hues. The small wooden storage shed behind the kitchen, where old furniture and spare lumber were kept, had taken a direct hit. The dry, aged pine, already tinder-like from the summer heat, had erupted into an inferno. The furious wind, which should have been an ally, instead became the fire's accomplice, fanning the flames and driving them with a greedy roar toward the saloon's rear wall, directly against the kitchen. Panic, swift and absolute, seized the saloon, the collective bravado of the drinkers, fueled by an evening of cheap whiskey, dissolved into raw, animal fear. Men who had boasted of fighting off bandits and bears now shoved and scrambled for the front doors. A frantic, trampling herd with only one thought escape. Chairs were overturned, tables shoved aside, and the sound of shattering glass was lost in the panicked shouts and the growing roar of the fire outside. In the midst of the chaos, a different kind of fear, sharp and specific, gripped Martha. "Ruby!" she shrieked, her face a mask of terror. "Where is Ruby?" Ruby had been in the small, curtained-off alcove behind the saloon's tiny stage, a makeshift dressing room where she stored her spare dresses and trinkets. The panicked rush of men fleeing the saloon had knocked over a heavy wardrobe, jamming the flimsy door to her alcove shut. Now, as the fire outside began to lick at the rear wall, a thick, acrid smoke, black and oily, began to pour through the gaps in the floorboards and under the door. It filled the small space with a blinding, choking cloud, a burning claw that seized her throat and sent her to her knees, coughing and gasping. Through the service window, Nora saw it all. She saw the orange glow, saw the terror on Martha's face, and understood with a sickening certainty what was happening. Her kitchen, her sanctuary, was in danger. But her gaze was fixed on the small, curtained stage, and the thin wisps of black smoke that were now curling out from beneath the velvet drape. She heard Ruby's first terrified, choked-off scream, a sound that was swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding chaos. The men were gone, a tide of fear that had receded, leaving only chaos in its wake. Only a few figures remained: Martha, frozen with terror by the bar; Jed, who had been on the porch and was now silhouetted against the fiery light of the doorway; and Nora. Nora didn't think. She acted. Her body moved with the fluid, instinctual efficiency of a creature that had survived a dozen other kinds of hell. She ripped a thick dish towel from its hook, plunged it into the water barrel, and tied the cold, dripping cloth over her nose and mouth. The smoke was thickest near the ceiling, a lethal black blanket. She dropped to her hands and knees, her world shrinking to the floorboards in front of her. She crawled through the abandoned main room, the heat from the rear wall already blistering the paint. She reached the stage, the smoke so thick she could barely see. She could hear a faint, desperate scratching from behind the curtain, and the sound of Ruby's ragged, panicked coughing. Nora found the door to the alcove. She pushed, but it wouldn't budge. The wardrobe had it blocked solid. There was no time to move it. She looked at the door's simple wooden latch, the only thing holding it shut from the outside. With a guttural cry of effort, she began to slam her shoulder against the flimsy wooden door. Again and again. Wood splintered, and a searing pain shot through her arm as her hand connected with the hot wood. But she didn't stop. On the third try, the latch shattered and the door swung inward. A wall of black smoke rolled out, but Nora crawled through it. She found Ruby on the floor, disoriented and gasping. There was no time for words. Nora grabbed the corner of a heavy velvet tablecloth from a nearby prop table, doused it with the contents of a water pitcher, and threw the heavy, sodden cloth over Ruby's head and shoulders. "Crawl!" Nora yelled, her voice a muffled rasp through her own wet mask. She grabbed a handful of Ruby's dress and began to pull, dragging her back the way she had come, back through the smoke-filled saloon, toward the hope of clean air. They emerged onto the front porch, two soot-blackened figures, collapsing into the rain-slicked mud. Nora's hands were screaming in agony, the skin red and blistered where she had beaten against the hot door. Just as they cleared the doorway, a section of the burning rear wall gave way with a deafening crash, sending a shower of sparks and embers into the night sky. Jed was there in an instant. He didn't hesitate. He swept both women up, one under each arm, and carried them across the street, away from the immediate danger, his face a grim mask of concentration. He deposited them gently on the covered porch of the general store before turning back to the fire. He ripped a heavy canvas tarp from a parked wagon, plunged it into a horse trough until it was saturated and impossibly heavy, and then, with a roar of effort, charged back toward the fire, using the wet tarp as a shield to beat back the flames that were trying to consume the main building. Ruby lay on the porch, coughing violently, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and relief. The fit of coughing finally subsided, and she pushed herself into a sitting position, her eyes, wide and wild, found Nora, who was slumped against a post, cradling her burned hands to her chest. Ruby looked at Nora's face, streaked with soot and tears, and then at the raw, blistered skin of her hands, and for the first time in her life, the laughter stopped. It didn't just fade, it died completely. A sudden, shocking silence in the landscape of her soul. The eyes that looked at Nora were not the hard, mocking eyes of a rival. They were filled with a dawning, shattering gratitude, and for the first time, the tears that welled up in them were real. Martha rushed over, her face a mess of tears and relief. She knelt and hugged Ruby fiercely, then turned to Nora, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Why?" Martha asked, her voice shaking. "After everything, why did you save her?" Nora looked up, her breathing ragged, her voice a hoarse, smoke-ravaged whisper. She didn't look at Ruby. She looked back at the fire that was consuming the back of the saloon, at the place that had become her world. "Because this is my kitchen," she said, each word an effort, "and people in my kitchen are to be left in peace." By now, the townspeople, drawn by the light and the noise, had begun to gather. They saw Jed fighting the flames alone, and something shifted. A man ran forward with a bucket from the horse trough, then another. A human chain formed, a bucket brigade snaking from the well in the center of town to the burning saloon. Men, women, and even the older children worked side by side, their movements frantic but unified. From the edge of the crowd, a figure emerged. It was Antoine, the chef from the Wayfarer's Inn. His white apron was pristine, his face a mixture of shame and awe. He stood for a moment, watching the organized chaos. Then, without a word, he took his place at the end of the line, taking a full bucket from a child and passing it down, his movement stiff and awkward. It was not an apology. It was an act of silent, public atonement. It took almost an hour, but together, they saved the saloon. The fire was beaten back, leaving the rear of the building a charred, steaming ruin. But the main structure, and Nora's kitchen, though smoke-damaged, was still standing. When the last of the flames had been extinguished, leaving only the hiss of dying embers and the smell of wet ash and scorched pine, an exhausted silence fell over the street. Nora sat on the steps of the general store, her hands now crudely but gently bandaged with linen provided by the storekeeper's wife. Jed approached her, his face and clothes black with soot. He knelt in front of her and offered her the canteen of water he had once brought to her back door. She took it with her bandaged hands and drank deeply. He watched her for a moment, his gray eyes soft in the dim light. "You've won," he said quietly. He wasn't talking about the fire. A moment later, a shadow fell over them. It was Ruby. Her fine silk dress was ruined. Her face was smudged with soot, and her hair was a tangled mess. All the artifice had been stripped away, leaving behind someone smaller, younger, and more fragile than Nora had ever imagined. She walked up to Nora and knelt in the mud in front of her. She was holding something in her hand. It was the razor-sharp chef's knife, the one Jed had left on Nora's doorstep. She held it out, not by the handle, but by the blade, offering the hilt to Nora. But Nora's hands were bandaged, so Ruby gently, reverently, placed the knife across Nora's lap. It lay there, its polished steel gleaming against the rough calico of her dress. "It's yours," Ruby said, her voice small and hoarse. She looked down at the ground, unable to meet Nora's eyes. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard. She took a deep, shuddering breath and finally looked up, her eyes pleading. Can I learn how to cook?" Nora looked at the young woman kneeling before her, at the genuine, desperate plea in her wet eyes. She looked at the fine knife lying in her lap, a tool of creation, not destruction. Then she looked at her own ruined hands. A long, slow breath passed through her lips. She gave a single, small nod, a gesture as simple, as involuntary, and as necessary as breathing. The reconstruction of the kitchen was a quiet, communal affair. The men of the town, led by the blacksmith, replaced the charred rear wall with sturdy new pine. Its fresh, resinous scent, a clean perfume that temporarily masked the lingering smell of smoke. The broken window was fitted with a new pane of glass, this one clearer and brighter than the old one had ever been. When the work was done, the kitchen was not just repaired, it was reborn. It was clean, orderly, and filled with a sense of quiet potential. Nora, with her bandaged hands still aching, directed the reorganization. Pots were scoured until they shone and hung in a neat, descending order of size. The larder was scrubbed clean, its shelves lined with fresh paper. A new, sturdy work table, a gift from the town carpenter, stood in the center of the room, on a small chalkboard hung by the door. Nora's handwritten menu became the saloon's new scripture, a testament to the beauty of simplicity. Corn cakes, bean stew, pan-seared beef, freshly brewed coffee. The most profound change, however, was not in the structure of the kitchen, but in its inhabitants. Ruby, stripped of her fine silk dresses and her sharp-edged laughter, became Nora's first and only apprentice. Her education did not begin at the stove. It began at the water barrel with a stiff brush and a mountain of greasy, soot-blackened pots. Nora had her scrub every pot, every pan, every fork and spoon that had been salvaged from the fire, until her own hands were raw and chapped. It was a humbling, grueling task, designed to teach a lesson that had nothing to do with seasoning and everything to do with respect for the tools of the trade. And through it all, Ruby did not complain. She worked with a grim, silent determination, and when she laughed now, a rare and precious sound. It was different. The sharp, mocking edge was gone, replaced by a softer, warmer tone, the sound of genuine amusement rather than a weapon of scorn. One morning, as Nora was showing Ruby how to properly render bacon fat, Martha entered the kitchen. She looked around at the clean, efficient space, at her daughter dutifully stirring a pot, and a long, slow sigh escaped her lips. She walked over to Nora, her expression a mixture of grudging respect and weary resignation. "The kitchen," Martha said, her voice gruff. "It seems to have chosen its own boss." She held out her calloused hand. "I reckon we don't need a written contract. As long as the doors open on time and the customers leave happy, the kitchen is yours." Nora looked at the outstretched hand, then at Martha's face. She saw the admission of defeat, but also the offer of a genuine truce. Nora wiped her own hand on her apron and took Martha's. The handshake was firm, brief, and binding. A new treaty had been signed in the quiet diplomacy of the kitchen. Peace, it seemed, was contagious. A few days later, a figure appeared at the back door, shifting his weight uncomfortably. It was Antoine, the chef from the Wayfarer's Inn. He was not wearing his pristine white apron. He was dressed in the simple, dusty clothes of a working man. In his hands, he held a large, full sack of premium stone-ground flour. He didn't offer an apology. His pride would not allow for such a direct capitulation. He simply thrust the sack forward. "A debt," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ground. "For the fire." Nora understood. It was his penance, his attempt to repay the community he had stood apart from for so long. She accepted the sack, its heavy weight a solid and satisfying thing. "Thank you," she said simply. But after he had gone, she took a piece of chalk and, on the new pine wall next to the larder, she made a single, sharp, white mark. It was a mark of accounting, a private entry in her own ledger. She would accept the peace offering, but she would not erase the memory of the bitterness that had preceded it. Forgiveness was a virtue, but forgetting was a fool's errand. That afternoon, Jed arrived, not with an offering, but with a gift. He had taken a smooth, wide plank of pine and had carefully burned a set of rules into its surface with a hot iron, the letters dark and permanent. He had even fashioned a simple frame for it. He hung it on the wall, in the space between the kitchen and the main saloon, where every customer who entered could see it. It read, "Nora's Kitchen Rules, Cook Kind, Talk Kind." It was his way of codifying her unspoken principles, of lending his own quiet authority to the sanctuary she had built. It was a shield forged of words. The sign, and the unspoken authority it represented, had a subtle but profound effect on the saloon's patrons. The men still drank, the piano still played, but a new current of respect ran through the room. They ate more slowly now, their conversations conducted in lower tones. It was not a silence born of fear, but of appreciation. They were no longer just filling their bellies, they were savoring the food, wanting to hold the taste of it on their tongues for a little longer. Nora, standing at her work table, would often look down at her hands. The burns from the fire were healing, leaving behind a new tracery of pale, silvery scars that overlaid the old ones. They were a map of her life, a testament to every fire she had faced, both literal and metaphorical. Her old declaration, her shield against the world, now felt different when she said it to herself. "I can cook, not flirt." It was no longer a warning. It was a statement of purpose, a quiet declaration of her identity, the morning prayer that began her working day. The new order was tested one evening when a brash young cowboy, new to town and unaware of the shift in the saloon's culture, tried to engage Ruby in the old way. As she set his plate down, he reached out and caught her wrist. "A plate of your finest, and a smile from your prettiest," he said with a wink. The old Ruby would have met this with a sharp retort or a practiced, dismissive laugh. The new Ruby simply stopped. She didn't pull her hand away. She just stood there and, with her free hand, pointed a single, steady finger at the new sign on the wall. The cowboy's eyes followed her finger. He read the words, "Cook kind, talk kind." A slow, dark flush crept up his neck. He dropped her wrist as if it were a hot coal and mumbled an apology, his gaze falling to his plate. When he paid his bill later, he left a tip that was twice the price of the meal. As the evening wound down, Nora was alone in the kitchen, cleaning up for the night. The saloon was quiet, the last of the customers having drifted out into the cool night air. She looked up and saw Jed standing at the back door. He didn't step inside. He never did. He always respected the invisible threshold, the boundary of her domain. He leaned against the doorframe, a tall, quiet silhouette against the deepening twilight. He was not there to offer help or to make demands. He was simply there, a steady, watchful presence. Nora paused her work, her hands still in the soapy water. She looked up, and their eyes met across the quiet, lamp-lit space. No words were spoken, none were needed. In that single, shared glance, a universe of understanding passed between them, a respect for her strength, an appreciation for his patience, and the quiet acknowledgement of a bond forged not in flirtatious words, but in silent, steadfast acts of kindness. The next morning, Nora rose before the sun. A cool, silvery mist clung to the ground, muffling the sounds of the waking town. She walked into her kitchen, the air cool and still. She went to the new window, the one that had replaced the shattered pane, and pushed it wide open. A gentle breeze, smelling of damp earth and the promise of a new day, drifted in. It swirled through the small space, a clean, fresh breath. The kitchen, it seemed, was breathing, and in the quiet, hopeful dawn, Nora stood in the heart of her sanctuary, and she listened, and the only sound she heard was the silence where the laughter used to be. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your location and your thoughts on Nora's journey. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd really like to support us, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.